Society is faced with a problem that needs to be solved collectively. What do? Do we depend on the government, or do giving more responsibilities to the government creates more problems than it should? Welcome to Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia, where we talk about whether or not the government makes sense the same way John Rawls describes it. Now, in this book, we are going to talk about moral constraints and the state. But before we do that, we are here to give you a few definitions, or terms and definitions. Monopoly. A monopoly is a market with the absence of competition, creating a situation where a specific person or enterprise is the only supplier of a particular thing. This is important in order to understand the following ideas. Ready? Okay, let's go. Let's begin with the state of governance called the minimal state and the ultra-minimal state. The minimal state, or the night watchman state, is a state of governance limited only to protecting the citizens from violence, theft, fraud, and to the enforcement of contracts. Meaning, you can't harm someone, you can't steal from someone, you can't fool someone, and you can't make someone promise you something and then hold it against them if they can't uphold their promise. Now, what about the ultra-minimal state? Well, the ultra-minimal state maintains a monopoly over all the use of force except that necessary in immediate self-defense. When we say monopoly, it means that they are the only organization that is capable of giving this certain thing, which in this case, protection and enforcement services. That is why the ultra-minimal state provides these stuff only to those who purchase its protection and enforcement policies. Now, what does this all mean for Nozick? Why did he introduce this to us? Well, because the minimal state is exactly like the ultra-minimal state, except for one little thing that creates a big impact to society. The minimal state is tax-funded, therefore it is redistributive in nature. Now, Nozick don't like the idea of redistribution because it compels people to pay for the protection of others rather than themselves. That's a problem because not everyone would want the idea of being protected. On the other hand, not everyone wants to give away their wealth for those who also don't want to be protected, because that would seem unfair. You don't want to be protected, but you're using my money to be protected. So what gives? That is why the proponent or president of the ultra-minimalist state is greatly concerned about protecting people's rights against violation, and he makes this as the sole legitimate function of the state. He may also protest that all other functions outside of this are illegitimate, for example taxing, because they themselves involve the violation of rights. But wait, hold on there, bucko. So you're telling me that if I can't afford these protection and enforcement policies, then I wouldn't be protected as well? In a way, yes, but also no, but somehow yes. What? So how is this reasonable? Your president or your proponent, whatever it is you want to call him, is inconsistent because it only cares about those who pay for their services. What about me? I want to be protected, but I can't afford that. Also, my friend wants to be protected and he doesn't want to pay for your services. He just wants the benefit of your protection. How are you gonna solve that? Well, let me introduce to you moral constraints and moral goals. To understand moral constraints and moral goals, let us first look at the utilitarian structure and how it manages people's rights. So we have utilitarianism plus the concern for rights equals utilitarianism of rights. Okay, so what's their goal? Their goal is to minimize the violation of rights, which would lead to the total happiness as the relevant end state in the utilitarian structure. With this in mind, it concludes that there are times when one person's rights has to be violated in order to protect the majority. How does this apply though? In what situation does this all set to play? Let me introduce to you my friend Vladimir Makarov. Note, this person does not actually exist in real life, I'm sorry, but that's just an example. To give an overview of his background, he is an ultranationalist terrorist, which means that he is a known terrorist leader worldwide. Now, despite this, according to natural law, Makarov has natural rights, but he has the potential to violate a lot of people's rights, considering that he is a terrorist. Say, for example, the massacre of Zakayev International Airport. Now, in order to prevent this, one must violate Makarov's rights in order to prevent a more catastrophic violation of rights. So the government would want to, seize, detain, or even end him before he does more damage. That all makes sense. Now, to put this into perspective, we have the means and end flowchart. This just means that in the structure of the utilitarianism of rights, their means are any actions that would lead to an end goal of having non-violation of rights or to have a minimum weighted violation of rights. Now, it would seem that these all make sense. There will be violations of rights, so the best thing to do is to minimize that. This will be our goal. But here's the catch. Though Nozick finds this plausible, he doesn't completely agree with this. Nozick is concerned of individual rights, but he doesn't agree to the idea that the end goal is the non-violation of rights or mitigation of rights violation. What he wants is for the end goal to be the people, and in order to achieve that, the means should be the non-violations of rights. How is this achieved? Through side constraints. But first, we need to understand what are constraints. Constraints are limitations or restrictions. You can't do this, you can't do that. Now we have moral constraints, which are the distinction between good and bad, and right and wrong. Side constraints, therefore, are a constraint upon action, where a person is not allowed to violate another's moral constraint, for example, their sense of right and wrong, in pursuit of one's goal. Now, going back to the problem where a person can't buy the ultra-minimalist protection and enforcement, they can be considered untouchable. Because if someone were to violate their moral constraints and moral rights, then that person has violated their side constraints. And the violation of side constraints will lead them to be punished or condemned. So we understand that the goal isn't the non-violation of rights. The goal is letting people be responsible for their side constraints without forcing them to buy protective services of the ultra-minimal state. If they violate their side constraints, for example, they commit violence, act of theft, or fraud, then they are condemned accordingly, whether or not they are protected by the ultra-minimal state or not. But you might be wondering, why side constraints? Isn't it irrational to accept a side constraint of moral rights rather than having the goal to minimize the violation of rights? If the non-violation of rights is so important, shouldn't that be the goal? Well, my friend, these questions points to the principle of utilitarianism of rights, where the means are directed so as to reduce the non-violation of rights. Again, there is a reason why Nozick denies this, and that is because of the Kantian principle, which states that individuals are end and not merely means. There is an underlying idea in the utilitarian structure that justifies sacrificing individuals for the sake of the benefit of the majority. Nozick states that these individuals may not be sacrificed or used for the achieving of other end without their consent, because he believes that individuals are inviolable. Individuals themselves intrinsically has rights and do not depend on anything, even the state. Now, you might be wondering, what are ends and what are means? We've all talked about this during the discussion right now. But what is an example of a mean? A prime example of a mean is a tool. Let's say, for example, a hammer. We can always use a hammer in specified ways in order to achieve a certain goal, like making a house or building a chair or fixing something. Essentially, a tool can be used according to how we want it, except for the moral constraints of using it against other people. Now, if it's broken, that's okay, we can just buy a new one. But what if we treat people like tools? People with individual lives do exactly what we want just to reach a certain goal. And if they break, that's okay. They serve their purpose. We can still get a new set of people to be used. How would you feel if someone treated you that way? Would you feel violated? Would you gain anything after you break? This is the reason why Nozick stresses the importance of individual rights. Don't use people in specified ways, Nozick states. This is the meaning of treating people as the end and not merely means. As Immanuel Kant puts it, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply by means, but always at the same time as an end. But if you're still here thinking, why not hold that some people have to bear some cost to benefit the other people more for the sake of the overall social good? The answer is simple. There is no social entity with a good that undergoes some sacrifice for its own good, according to Nozick. You can't take a finger off your hand and expect that you'll work the same or better than before. He continues by saying, we have to understand that there are only individual people, different individual people, with their own individual lives. Using one of these people for the benefit of others uses him and benefits the others. Nothing more. What happens is something is done to him for the sake of others. A person is his own separate person. He is the only life he has. There is no overbalancing good to gain towards him for his sacrifice, and no one is entitled to force this upon him. Now, with that in mind, I welcome you, Mr. Carlo Jackie Eliavera, for his part of the report.
Nozick believes that no one's rights should be violated because everyone has its own life to lead. No one should be sacrificed for others, and aggressions among individuals should be erased. Nozick then continued, saying or explaining a principle, and this principle is called the non-aggression principle. It is a principle that governs the relationship between nations. Through this principle, it prohibits one nation to use force or inflict force towards another nation in order to have peace and to not violate the right of that nation. Nozick stated that questions will arise in connection to non-aggression principle, saying that if non-aggression principle is used to govern the relationship between nations, why is that it was not used to stop the aggression against individuals? Nozick continued answering that kind of question. He says that non-aggression towards individuals is much stronger, simply because there are laws and rights that prohibit one individual to use or inflict aggression towards another person. He then continued and explained the non-aggression principle, saying that non-aggression does not prohibit the use of force physically for defense if the nation may found it as a threat to them, even though he is an innocent threat. So what is an innocent threat? An innocent threat is a person who possesses an imminent threat to your life, but who is not the originating cause of that threat. It means that an innocent threat is a person who is being used or manipulated in order to inflict force towards a person. This is applied to the non-aggression principle, which it does not prohibit the use of force physically for defense in order to defend their nation, even though you are an innocent threat. Nozick continued then saying that libertarian prohibitions are made in order to stop violence against innocent people, but with regards to innocent threat, it is another matter that different principles should be applied, simply because the aim of libertarianism is to let everyone lead their own life. Libertarian constraints allow a person to be free and not be afraid of the aggressions of others. But Nozick stated that libertarian prohibitions does not cover the innocent threats, and there should be different principles that should be applied. Next is the constraints and animals. Are there any limits to what we may do to animals? Have animals the moral status of mere objects? Do some purposes to fail to entitle us to impose great costs on animals? What entitle us to use them at all? Those questions, according to Nozick, he pursued the notion of moral side constraints because Nozick believes that we should give moral weight same as people to animals, since once an animal exists, it should have a claim of a certain treatment. He then continued saying the idea of utilitarianism for animals, Kantianism for people. In the utilitarianism for animals, Kantianism for people, it maximizes the total happiness of all living beings, place stringent side constraints on what one may do to humans. This also includes that human beings may not be used or sacrificed for the benefit of others. Animals may be used or sacrificed for the benefit of other people or animals only if those benefits are greater than loss inflicted. Animals will be used for the gain of other animals and persons, but persons will never be used or harmed, sacrificed against their will for the gain of animals. Nothing may be inflicted upon the person for the sake of animals. With this idea being said, Nozick contradicted with this idea, saying that if persons will not be used against their will for the gains of animals, is it okay to violate the right of every animals? Is it okay to apply or enforce cruelty towards animals? Nozick stated that no, we should not impose cruelty towards animals, and somehow we should inflict sufferings to a person in order to stop these kinds of aggressions and these kinds of cruelty, in order to avoid greater sufferings among individuals and also among animals. In continuation, utilitarianism is notorious inept with decisions where numbers of persons is at issue. Maximizing the average utility allows a person to kill everyone else if that would make him ecstatic and so happier than average, because the idea of utilitarianism is that for the greater good of greatest numbers, if the total happiness is much greater than the loss inflicted, it is okay to kill a person as long as the average is much higher than the loss inflicted. Same as with animals. Like, it is okay if we kill animals for our gain if it benefits more than the loss it inflicted. For Nozick, Even in animals, utilitarianism is not enough, but rather will give us a full maze of questions. In continuation, Nozick discusses a machine wherein you can plug yourself in a capsule-like machine and have an experience out of it just by putting yourself in that machine. He called this machine the experience machine. In the experience machine, you can plug in and have the experience of the things you want. The machine is programmed in order for you to have an experience just like doing it in the reality. In this machine, you can experience anything that you want. It's either in this machine you can experience eating the best flavor of ice cream you want, being the best basketball player, or even the president of the state. Through this machine, you will experience these kinds of pleasures. But the question is, would a person choose to experience things outside the machine, or rather choose to experience it inside the experience machine? Nozick continued and says that a person will always choose to experience this outside the machines because of 3 reasons. So the 3 reasons are: first, we want to do certain things. Every people want to do certain things in the reality. They want to try it, and in order to feel what it's like to experience that kind of happenings. First is that we want to do certain things. We want to do it in a certain way or a certain sort of person. Simply because doing these things allow us to feel the sensation of experiencing this kind of happening or event in our life. It allows us to feel what it is like through experiencing this event. Next is that plugging in the experience machine limits us to a man-made reality. It hinders us to dig deeper and have a reflection of what we experience. It will be an hindrance wherein we can do self-reflection in order to improve ourselves by experiencing this kind of event. So these are the 3 reasons why Nozick said that a person will always choose to experience outside the machine rather than choosing to experience it rather inside the experience machine.
Good day everyone, my name is Christian Cabactol and I'm going to discuss the underdetermination of moral theory, what are constraints based upon, and the individualist anarchy. Elitist hierarchical structures or hierarchical scales where being was identified in their status standing in society, and elitist hierarchical scales have 3 moral statuses. First is the being may not be sacrificed, harmed, and so on for any other organism. Second, the being may be sacrificed, harmed, and so on for the sake of being higher on the scale, but not for the sake of being with same level. Third, the being may be sacrificed, harmed, and so on for the sake of other being with same higher level on the scale. If animals occupy status 3 and we occupy status 1, what makes status 2 to be occupied by human? And if it is we occupy status 2, is it morally forbidden to use people as means for the benefits of other? Some theological belief that holds that God is permitted to sacrifice his people for his own purpose. We might also consider the possibility of human coming into contact with extraterrestrial entities who get through whatever moral stages or development psychologists can name as children. However, a theological theory that optimizes the total value will not forbid some people from being sacrificed in order to benefit other people. there would not be a net gain if some were sacrificed for others, but there also would not be a net loss. But not for the benefits of being at the same level or lower. Only being who holds the intermediate status too will be willing to be sacrificed if they will never come into contact with, learn about, or have an impact entities on higher up the hierarchy. They will always inhabit the highest level in every situation they do, really comes across and consider. They won't be able to sacrifice for any purpose, as though there is an unbreakable side restriction prohibiting it. The absolute side constraint theory and deleterious hierarchical theory, which places people in status 2, provide the identical moral judgment for the actual situation people have encountered and equally well account for all the moral judgment we made.
What constraints based upon? From the word itself, constraints means limitations or restriction or anything that limit a system from achieving a higher performance versus its
If
goals.
the first topic talks about the views of a size of constraints and the view of a more complicated hierarchical structures, this topic talks about a virtue of precisely what characteristic of a person are their moral constraints on how they treat each other.
So, what characteristic of a person's are their moral constraints on how they may treat or treat each others, or the way they be treated? The traditions of suggestions for the crucial character traits associated with the moral obligations are followed: being sensible and self-aware, rational, having free will, being agent capable of guiding its behavior by moral principles and capable of engaging in mutual limitations of conducts, and having a soul. Let's put aside concerns regarding how this notion should be defined precisely, whether human beings are the only ones who possess these traits, in order to focus on how they relate to moral restrictions placed on others. With the exceptions of the last on the list, none of them appear to be sufficient to create necessary connections. Why does it matter if a person is extremely intelligent, perceptive, or high IQ? Is there a need to limit how we treat it, especially above a particular threshold? Would entities who are even more brilliant than we have the right to disregard our limitations? Or does in any alleged significant threshold actually means? It would appear that a person's characteristic, by virtue of which others are constrained in their treatments of him, must themselves be valuable characters. So, if being capable of choosing autonomously among alternatives, is there some reason to let it do so? Our autonomous choice is intrinsically good. If being could make only once an autonomous choice, say between flavors of ice cream on a particular occasion, and would forget immediately afterwards, would there be a strong reasons to allow it to choose? Or that being can agree with others to mutual rules govern limitations on conduct shows that can observe limit, but does not show which limit should be observed towards it. Should be able to comprehend why others have placed so much emphasis on the qualities of reasons, free choice, and moral agency. However, haven't we been unfair by considering reason, free will, and moral agencies in isolation from one another? Together, don't they make up something whose significance is obvious, a being capable of creating a long-term plans for its life, able to think about and make decisions for itself based on abstract principles or considerations, and thus not merely the playthings of immediate stimuli, a being that restricts its own behavior in accordance with some principles or visions it has of what appropriate life is for itself and others, and so on. The three features that serve as the foundation for its decisions general life philosophy, because a being could have these three qualities but also some internal restriction that stops it from functioning in terms of an overarching pictures of its life and what it means to adapt to. So let's include the capacity to control and direct its life in line with a larger version that it chooses to accept as an additional features. The kind of objective we set for ourselves and type of being, we are dependent on having a broad perspective understanding how we are performing in relation to it. Individual anarchist focus on a private protection scheme, because even when one protective agency dominates a specific geographic area, a system of private security still seems to fall short of a state. It appears to lack the monopoly over the use of force required of a state. It does not
appear to offer protections to everyone inside its borders, and it does not appear to claim protections for everyone in its area, and it does not appear to be a minimum state, nor it does not appear to be an ultra-minimal state. The core of the individualist anarchist criticism against the state in these very ways in which the dominant protective agencies or association in an area apparently falls short of being a state, because he believes that when the state or a state monopolizes the use of force in an area and punishes those who violate it, as well as when it offers protection for everyone by requiring some pay for the protections of others, it breaches moral side constraints on how people may be treated. Thus, it draws the conclusion that the state is inherently immoral. Given that it violates other rights itself, the states concede that in some cases it is acceptable to penalize those who do so. And how does then it claims the right to prevent others, non-aggressive people, from seeking justice privately when their rights have been violated?